Good morning, and welcome to today's discussion on the future of the care economy. I'm Marty Flax, Director of the Human Rights Initiative and Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. By 2030, more than 2.3 billion people around the world will be in need of care, including children, individuals with disabilities, and as we increasingly live to our 80s, 90s, and beyond, the elderly. At the same time, this $6 trillion industry in the U.S. alone is beset by multiple contradictory challenges. BCG estimates that by 2030, the U.S. will lose $290 billion per year if we don't address two of the most critical of these challenges. The first is a severe shortage of workers to fill critical care economy jobs. The second is the loss of productivity as full-time workers are forced to withdraw from the workforce to take care of family and friends. The ILO estimates that 647 million people around the world of working age, most of them women, are outside the labor force due to family responsibilities for care. It's worth emphasizing that most of these individuals are women and that this challenge disproportionately affects women who are responsible for providing care, contributing not only to limitations in economic growth and development around the world, but contributing to exacerbating gender inequalities as well. As the demand for care workers increases, governments are under increasing pressure as well to make new investments into the care economy, to improve the conditions of workers already in the sector who are too often subject to abuse and exploitation, and also to reduce the economic and gender divide that undermines economic growth and broader economic resilience. The U.S., for example, took a step in this direction when it mandated that recipients of funding from the CHIPS and Science Act provide childcare opportunities to their workers. But this is one step, and much more needs to be done if the U.S. and other global economies are going to maximize the potential of its workforce and build its economic resilience. In today's discussion, our experts will talk about the human rights, economic, and national security imperatives of addressing the growing demand for care economy workers while guaranteeing that those workers who enter and participate in the sector are protected from exploitation and abuse. I'm joined now by three experts in this field who I'm going to ask to each make about 5 minutes of introductory remarks, followed by a conversation among our panelists. At the end of the conversation, I'll invite questions from our online audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so on the CSIS event webpage using the question button. Let me first turn now to Wendy Chun-Hoon. Wendy serves as the 20th director of the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, appointed by President Biden on February 1st, 2021. She's held senior positions in Maryland state government and private philanthropy, overseeing large-scale results-driven initiatives for worker and family economic justice. For 10 years, Wendy led Family Values at Work, a national network of grassroots coalitions that won more than 60 new paid leave policies, bringing new rights to 55 million workers and their loved ones, and organizing to win greater access to childcare, fair wages, and better employment conditions at work. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Marty, for that generous introduction, but also for gathering us today. It's really good here to be with all of you. I wanted to make sure that everybody knows who the Women's Bureau is and what we do. So I'll share a couple of things. We're over 100 years old as an agency, and our mission all this time really has been to push for better jobs and wages and benefits for women across the country. The other thing to mention is that we're the only congressionally mandated federal agency that is solely dedicated to the betterment of women in the American workforce. So historic mission and a big one. My team knows that I love to talk about the superpowers of the Women's Bureau. And one of them is really a longstanding quantitative analysis and policy analysis. And we use that superpower to keep a laser focus on how working women are faring, what are the conditions in our economy, and also our workplaces that continue to hold us back. So to the point of today's conversation, I think the bottom line is that America works because of the work of caregivers, both unpaid caregivers and paid. And our country could definitely work better if we invested in our care infrastructure. So a couple of things to talk through there. Women's Bureau recently released some analysis showing that if the United States had the same level of women's workforce participation as, say, countries like Germany or Canada, which invest a lot more in caregivers and policies that support them, like paid leave, like affordable childcare, we would add more than $775 billion annually in additional economic activity. 775 billion. So hold on to that for a second. Maybe we can unpack it later. I want to mention another thing that the Women's Bureau produced earlier this year. It's a completely novel database, first of its kind, called the National Database on Childcare Prices. So what it is it holds more than a decade's worth of childcare price data. It's tracked all the way down to the county level in the United States. It breaks down data by the age of the child, the type of care provider, along with county level economic and demographic characteristics. And in sum, what the database shows is that, no matter where you live, whether you're living in a rural community or an urban community, north, south, east, west, across the country, that childcare prices are untenable for families across our country. The median childcare price, this is per child, range from roughly 8% of average family income, that's at the low end, all the way up to better than 19% of family income. So that's, $5,000 to over $17,000 per child per year. So holding on to that, the third thing that I would say is, of course, caregiving work can be rewarding, but it's really difficult. It can be draining, both physically and mentally. And so, we're in this paradox with the care economy. Care work is at an all-time high in demand, as you said in your opening, but it's also financially out of reach for families. But the third pillar is that professional care workers are really paid a median of less than $15 an hour. These are not family sustaining jobs. So, holding that sort of triangle together in this conversation is important. Maybe I'll end by saying a little bit about what the administration has really focused on, because we know, everybody across the administration knows that caregivers need and deserve better. And so, this administration, Biden-Harris administration, has made historic investments in the care workforce, really addressing care support needs of working families. We're continue to connect the fact, and you said this in your opening, that our ability to rebuild America's infrastructure, roads, bridges, et cetera, really absolutely relies on our investing in a strong and sustainable care infrastructure. And this is why earlier this year, President Biden signed an executive order that called on all of us to increase access to high quality care and also provide more support for caregivers. So close to home at the Department of Labor, what that meant is that we're doing things like working with our counterparts at Health and Human Services to support federal agencies across the US government to really see how they can increase spending on access to care for the workforce that's involved in the infrastructure investments, for example. Another big action item for us, and we just published these last week, and I hope to get to talk about these a little bit more, were sample employment agreements for domestic workers. So these are our house cleaners, our home care workers, nannies who are employed by us as private citizens in our homes. And we, have heard a lot directly from domestic workers about what a priority it is to have these sample workforce agreements. Domestic workers are overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly immigrant women, depending on the job, overwhelmingly women of color. And the work that they do, as we all know, is in high demand. What these sample workforce agreements do is really help to rebalance the power between domestic workers and their employers, really give a voice to workers in some of those could be vulnerable and precarious work arrangements. So just a couple of things that we're doing, obviously, all to support caregivers and those who need care, and really looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And great framing for us. And we're going to definitely keep those numbers in mind. That $775 billion opportunity is one of them. Let me bring in Sujai Shivakumar. Sujai is the Director and Senior Fellow for CSIS's Renewing American Innovation Project. Sujai brings more than 20 years of experience in policy studies relating to U.S. competitiveness and innovation, workforce development, and entrepreneurship. In his previous role as Director of the Innovation Policy Forum at the National Academies of Science, he contributed to over 50 assessments of U.S. and foreign innovation programs. So Sujai, you are the right person to weigh in on this challenge for us. Over to you for some opening remarks.
Yeah, I guess the two thoughts, and very much agree with the perspectives that were just shared just now. The first thought is in terms of global competition. Firms will locate where they have skilled, available skilled, both high skill and skilled technical work. In order to get the skilled technical workforce, you need to have systems where workers, students have access and are able to access the coursework, the apprenticeships, the work experience that they need to meet the needs of local firms, global firms, and unless you have solved the care issue, these individuals are not going to be in that workforce. So you in a competitive international context, unless you solve the care problem, you're not going to be able to solve the workforce problem. And if you don't solve the workforce problem, the economic growth that comes with investment decisions by the private sector will not be forthcoming. And so you start going into a sort of a negative spiral. So we also need to think about, as the previous speaker noted, this is in many ways as foundational for our infrastructure as roads and ports and bridges and so forth. We built those understanding that we need the structure in order for our economy to grow, for people to connect, for people to be able to access opportunities. And this is in some ways a very similar type of situation. There was also some reference earlier to some of the legislation passed last year in terms of chips and science, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Jobs and Infrastructure Act, and so forth. A lot of those are placing new emphasis now on the renewal of the American economy. And, this is an important part of that renewal. We need to think about childcare in many ways the same way that we think about infrastructure. It's not something that is, good to have or something that is a soft need. It's very critical, basically, for our renewal and our growth as an economy.
Thanks, Sujai. Absolutely. So let me finally bring in Ariana Drakatos-Schindel to our conversation. Ariana is the Director of Training and Curriculum Design for Worker Rights and Equity at the Worker Institute at Cornell University. And Ariana has spent more than a dozen years designing trainings and curricula to assist community labor and social justice movement leaders in transforming their organizations and building worker and grassroots power. She recently worked with the National Domestic Workers Alliance Care Forward campaign, which seeks to raise wages and industry standards for workers in the care economy. So Ariana, welcome your perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so good to be here with everyone. Yeah, and I want to start this off with a bit more of a personal angle and name for you where I stand. So I'm a person in need of care. I'm a paid caregiver in the care economy, and I also have worked for the past decade on care issues, particularly with domestic workers. And I have chronic health issues. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I work as an organizer and work at an academic institution focused on care and labor policy. And the reason that's important is because that intersectionality is the key aspect of the care economy, that all of us have or will need care. And a huge number of us do a percentage of unpaid care work. Currently, that number is at about 53 million unpaid caregivers. It's going to nearly double by 2040, right? And that shows us the widening gulf between this vast need for care in our society and the limited accessibility of care that's led us into the current care crisis. And that's because of these important issues, the personal and the professional, the Cornell Worker Institute in June led the Future of Care convening. We brought together policymakers, workers, academics to come together and really define what does centering the care of care workers look like and what could that mean for our economy as a whole. And I just want to paint a picture for a moment. We opened up with an exercise I led where we had over 200 people in the room. Many were care workers or advocates, and we asked them to stand on a spectrum from where they felt devalued to valued in the work during the pandemic and now. And if you're sitting in the audience, you can imagine where most people stood, right? Most people stood on the side of the devalued, both during the pandemic and now. We had, nursing home workers who talked about holding dying patients in their arms as their colleagues died around them. Domestic workers, nannies who said, because of the lack of access to childcare, I care for other people's children all day and I can't come home and take care of my own, right? And the challenges around that, there were those on the other side who have benefited from the incredible organizing work, nurses who had gone on strike and gotten fair staffing ratios, cooperative home care workers who had built in the South a Black home care workers co-op that was transforming systems of care through worker ownership. But because of this historic devaluation and invisibilization of care work that is done largely, as has been said, by women and women of color particularly, policies have to center and understand that we have to shift that devaluation in order to shift the care economy as a whole. And this group came up together with some core policy recommendations, though broad. We'll be able to talk a little more about the detailed recommendations that can help the care economy for each sector of workers. But we did identify how essential it is for programs for aging and disabled people to be able to live at home without prohibitive out-of-pocket costs and long waiting lists, more robust social benefits for care workers, universal paid leave, access to affordable health and quality care, universal health care, affordable housing, even transportation, right? Obviously, we've talked a lot about living wages and improved benefits for care workers, especially with domestic workers and other care workers, improved access to unionization, not only for stronger labor laws to protect workers in union organizing, but even more importantly, stronger and fully funded enforcement. And that includes immigrant care workers having access and paths to unionization. And finally, the training that is so essential to help uplift care workers in our care economy without the burden of credentialing that puts many care workers deeply more behind in a bind. So I think this is such a powerful conversation to be having in this critical moment and to see the expanse that we can have on the local and global care economy together.
Thanks so much, Ariane, and thanks to all of you for helping frame out this discussion. I think to start with, I would love to hone in on this economic argument for a minute, because several of you made the point about just how foundational the care economy is to our broader economic growth and development, and that it shouldn't be thought of as an extra or a bonus, but actually a critical piece of our economic growth. So, Sujay, let me turn to you, because you've argued in your past work that providing workers, for example, with access to childcare is an economic imperative, not just a social one. Can you lay out for us a little bit more what that economic argument looks like, what that impact is if we don't provide that kind of support to our workers, what that looks like for our economic resilience?
Yeah, so again, I mentioned the legislation that was passed last year in terms of our renewal. So if you think about manufacturing, which is the focus of some of this legislation, manufacturing is really critical for our innovation system. Our innovation system is what is the engine that powers our economy. It produces new products, new services. It creates wealth. It creates prosperity. It creates jobs, and it's an important asset that we as a nation have in terms of our ability to compete as well as for our national security. So manufacturing is connected to other parts of the innovation system, including our research systems, our capital systems, our university systems, so forth. For the manufacturing sector to work well, you need workers, and in order for workers to be able to have access to training, have access to get to the job, you need to have flexible employment. You need to have childcare because you have men and women who are taking care of their parents, you're taking care of their children, disabled family members. all of that needs, all of those social needs are still there. And there needs to be a way for example, community colleges to provide courses non-traditional hours, because this is what this is what they're able to do in order to attract this people to gain these skills. You need to have employers who are again flexible, and you also need to have the childcare infrastructure. So, for example, in France, you have this system of creches for children who are, I think, 2 months to 3 years old. It's a sign of how well that system is regarded, that the wealthy use it. It's not just people who are on the lower end of the economic spectrum. So a world-class childcare system is something that is available for everybody, and everybody recognizes it, uses it, values it. And it's it's an asset that we have collectively. It's a benefit for our economy. It helps drive the value of our workforce in terms of the training they can absorb, in terms of their being able to show up for work on a reliable basis, in terms of firms locating and investing in the United States in various localities, because this is where the trained workforce this is where they find them. So as the world is realigning itself, there's sort of this new reshoring or smart shoring. The world is readjusting its value chains, particularly at this time when firms are actively making locational decisions. It's very important that they are looking for places where they have credible workforce, trained workforce, available workforce. And so in connection with that, we also need to think about the infrastructure for childcare, because without that, you won't have the available workforce that is necessary to drive our innovation economy, our manufacturing economy, and then therefore the economic benefits, the competitive benefits, and the national security benefits that flow from all of that. The other argument, of course, is that we are also investing in our future. It's not just a current issue. We need to have children who are well socialized, and who have a very strong start to their educational life ahead, and training life ahead, and work life ahead. And so this is again, it's not just an economic imperative; it's a social imperative, and in addition to being obviously a moral imperative.
Yeah, thanks, Sujai. Let me, Wendy, bring you back in, because we've mentioned a few times that the workers in this economy, particularly the unpaid part of the economy, are disproportionately women, as well as in some sectors of the care economy itself. What are the challenges that women in particular face, and what's the impact of that disproportionate gender balance on the economic impact of the care economy, or the challenges that the care economy is facing in our economic resilience?
Yeah, I might go back to something that I think we've all said, but Sujai, you definitely just said, which is the interconnectedness of all of these issues, right? So that sort of triangle that I outlined at the beginning about both how care workers' work has been undervalued, underpaid for millennia, and how yet we all rely on it, especially in terms of women's labor force participation. So, women, just to say again, women are the majority of the care workforce. These are jobs that are the lowest paying jobs in our economy. When we, just to go back to the pandemic and what happened, care industries were the slowest to recover from the pandemic, again, entirely due to how they were undervalued, longstanding prior to the pandemic. And so, they're finally showing growth again, but they're still down from numbers before the pandemic, but at the height of it, we were down 12%, 14% in childcare, in elder and adult care. These are, workers that and I'm going back to the discussion we were having and Adriana added about domestic workers, not just low paid, but excluded from labor law protections, little bargaining power, and that's starting to change. But it's very isolated, often informal work, And that brings a bunch of exposure to other tough working conditions, gender-based violence and harassment, for example. So, none of these things is separate from each other. What Sujai was saying in terms of who bore the brunt of the pandemic and why, coming around to what happened to maternal employment, it dropped by close to 16% in April, the height of the pandemic in April 2020. That was a much larger decline than what fathers experienced. And then fathers' employment regained their pre-pandemic levels much sooner, a full year sooner than when mothers' pre-pandemic employment caught back up. So again, all of these things are connected. We saw a lot of these losses. I'm remembering a report that we issued to sort of unpack all of these things. It was called, appropriately titled, Bearing the Cost, and really got into who bore the cost of the pandemic and why, because of these underlying conditions. And it was absolutely because of the types of jobs that most women are in, how those jobs, like care jobs, have been devalued, and which sectors actually bore the brunt of the pandemic. So again, just all to reinforce how interconnected these things are and what price we pay in terms of gender equity in the United States because of it.
Thanks, Wendy. Let me continue on that theme, and Ariana, bring you in on this question of how interconnected these challenges are. And it's really a question any of you may want to weigh in on, but this question is, how do we create a system that is where care is affordable for people who need that care? They need the child care or the elder care or the assistance, but also that care workers are adequately paid and protected and have the kind of social safety net that they need. And Ariana, you talked about being, both a giver of care and a receiver of care. You play all the roles in this care economy. How do we get that balance right? And what kind of policies do we need from the government side to help create that right balance?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I think while we were able to kind of bring together the policies that are general across the care economy, one of the specific challenges of organizing in the care economy is there's very diverse and sometimes divergent sectoral needs. Mm-hmm. And so I'll just start off by, naming what we all know, that Biden's executive order on increasing access to high quality care and supporting caregivers was a really important step in the right direction. It had these 3 important proposed rules, but it doesn't necessarily have the congressional funding that we need, which I need to underscore is essential for any kind of meaningful policy change to happen. And so I'll just break down very quickly some general important recommendations for some of these different sectors, and my colleagues can add on. So let's start with domestic workers, which we know are often essential and excluded workers, deeply affected by the pandemic. We have a domestic worker bill of rights that has passed in 10 states, 2 cities, but needs to have a federal legislation. And so NDWA, the National Domestic Worker Alliance, and affiliates across the country are currently pushing for that federal inclusion because domestic workers were left out of the 1930s labor laws because of racialized exclusion. They have to pass on state levels their own bills to be protected, right? So enhancing and expanding that bill, obviously expanded paid sick leave for them, and anti-discrimination legislation is really important. We just last year were able to win the inclusion of domestic workers in New York in the human rights law, saying they were protected from sexual harassment just this year, right? With nurses and nursing assistants, we've seen some incredible progress, right? So there's just opening for public comment. We have the CMS nursing home staffing rule, which has opened, which not only looks at ratios, so there's safer ratios between caregivers and receivers, but also hours, so 2.5 hours of certified nursing care. That federally passing would be a game changer for the nurses and nursing assistants, right, who are often now on strike, many of them, because they'll be in an emergency room unit, have 3 nurses where they need 9, right? And what happens to our care when the nurses can't get to us? Obviously, in nursing, there's also workplace violence protection mechanisms that are being passed around the country, but are also really important due to the nature and the relational nature of care work, right? For childcare workers, vastly complicated, just a few simple ones, which we all know, expansion of universal pre-K, the subsidies and financial support are so important. We saw it in the American Rescue Plan that there was more money for childcare stabilization grants, but a majority was really spent on these compensation grants for early childhood care workers. And of course, we'll talk more about wages in a minute, but the expansion of wages around that. And then direct care workers, which, is an area where we hear a lot about. Particular direct care workers are earning poverty wages, usually limited access to healthcare. And while our public tax dollars are being invested, often they're going into private care, and the overhead costs are so high that workers are not seeing the benefits or the wages increase. So we need better infrastructure legislation, increased Medicaid funding. We have the CMS's proposed rule that 80% of reimbursement rates for personal care workers goes directly to the compensation again, which is really, really essential. And so that transparency and that public funding and ensuring that agencies keep overhead costs low is really important. And of course, finally, support for family caregivers and legislation that will expand provisions for them. So those are some of those. And in addition to obviously living wage increases that move with inflation and time, and overall public investment in the care infrastructure, to name a few.
Thanks, Ariana. That's a great list. Wendy or Sujay, I don't know if either of you want to come in on this question of how we get that economic balance right to make it both cost effective for those in need of care, as well as make sure that those providing the care are adequately compensated and protected. Wendy, do you want to come in on that?
Oh, I think Ariana said it in many ways. I mean, we need significant public investment in order to realize those kinds of changes. I had mentioned the report that we just reissued. So we updated the numbers. It was a 2015 report, and we wanted to see have we made any progress. So the report is titled "The Cost of Doing Nothing," and happy to share these links afterwards. But when we see data from, for example, the OECD, this was just last year, I think, that the United States is 26th out of 36 countries on our early childhood and care expenditures, on women's workforce participation. I think we came in dead last out of all the 15 OECD countries with the largest GDPs per capita. The point of the paper that my colleague just reissued about the cost of doing nothing is that we're really focused. A lot of the political rhetoric is really focused on what are the costs of these social policies. And I think what we need to do is actually flip that on its head, as this report recently did, and say, we are paying a price. And so what really do we want to value here?
Thanks,
I think
Sujay.
this is what economists call the opportunity cost. I mean, there are upfront costs, and then the costs, as you put it so well, the cost of doing nothing. The last time we really thought about these issues was perhaps in the World War II era, where women were entering the workforce in large numbers. Our social structures were very different at that time, and the public policy was adequate given the existing infrastructure, which is the social infrastructure that existed at that time. Today, our society has changed. It's 100 years later almost. And so we need to think about, if we are serious about how do we develop the care economy, which is, again, as I've argued, is really important for our economic growth and competitiveness. We need to understand it a little bit from the ground up. In what ways are we complementing? What are the needs, as well as what are the policy mechanisms? I mean, we tend to think that the federal government passes a law, presto, it's all fixed. And these are any legislation is an experiment in some respects. So to what extent does federal legislation actually fit our society, our existing assets? And of course, there's federal legislation, but a lot of these, what we're talking about is actually much in our federal system, a much more state and local issue. And so it's a question of, what are firms doing? Is it a problem that can be largely addressed in any given particular local setting by the private sector, or are there, for example, free rider problems? If you have, say, 7 firms and 5 of them provide childcare, the other 2 free ride on the other 7, often that problem will prompt none of them to provide childcare. So is there a mechanism to encourage or discourage free riding, and thereby encouraging a private sector solution? If it's going to be an entirely or much more thoroughly public sector solution, is it being managed in a way that also draws in market principles like competition, like accountability? It's not one or the other. So it very much depends on the local market, and what we need is something that's adapted to a variety of different local labor markets, local cultural expectations, local social norms. And so one of the advantages of being a diverse country is that we have a federal system that is, by its nature of its federalism, is well adapted. So what can actually, but at the same time, we also need to have, from a national perspective, certain expectations, norms about what we as a country stand for in terms of worker protections. Those kinds of issues have to be conditions across the board, whatever the local solution is. So federalism is sort of this dance from the top down and the bottom up, and we need to sort of re-engage in that and take it, again, very seriously as a national issue, but one whose expressions are often at the local and state levels.
It's a great point, and I want to come back to this question of where we're seeing interesting movement or innovation at the state and local level. But first, I want to stay on this question of the private sector, because you mentioned earlier that, of course, the private sector is looking at local conditions to make decisions about where to invest. How much is the opposite happening? How much are workers or potential employees thinking about what kind of care economy support that their employer might be providing? Is that a factor that's going into people's employment decisions? And are you seeing companies think about things like childcare, leave policies, flexible work policies as a potential economic advantage? Are there places you're seeing innovation in that space?
Yeah, it sort of depends on the size of the firm and the circumstance. So if it's a large firm providing childcare, that encourages people to work for that firm, and there's a certain loyalty that's built in. That can be an advantage. If you're a small firm, you may not be able to scale and provide those kinds of services at scale, which means you have to cooperate with other firms in your area to provide that. So that challenge of actually linking up with other companies, other economic enterprises in your community is a difficult task to do. And this is where, for example, a public role can be there. So it's sort of a public-private partnership type of situation. We tend to think about polar opposites. It's either a completely private solution or a completely state solution. Whereas if you actually look across the country, what you actually see are a whole series of hybrid solutions, and they're all different. But they all have to be tailored to local realities. And so, what is the nature of the labor market? What is the nature of the size of employers, the diversity of employers, and their capacity to provide such services? And then what role can assistive role can the federal government or the state and local governments provide in these respects? And so that is something that it's a large undertaking, and I'm glad that through these conversations and others that we will start to engage in these themes, because it's really important for our renewal from the bottom up.
Yeah. So on that topic of the bottom up, I really want to hear from each of you where you are seeing interesting innovation in this space, maybe at the state or local level, maybe globally. What solutions you're seeing having been experimented on or tried out that have been successful and you think are potentially worth replicating or scaling? Ariana, do you want to come in on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think for the labor movement, we have lots of global examples of more progressive policies that give space for the intersection of caregiving to be held both in the economy and in the lives of our citizens. One of the things that we've noticed particularly is that while a lot of policies are passed, the actual enforcement of those policies and the protections is not invested in. And so I'd like to say, where are we seeing that working is where we see a policy and we see enforcement go hand in hand, which is really essential. And so there's some like quick examples of that with domestic workers, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. Affiliates of the National Domestic Worker Alliance, academic partners like Cornell are working on different initiatives that can help ensure enforcement from local and state standards boards to the kind of contracts that Wendy and the Women's Bureau and others have put out that are helping ensure that that enforcement happens. We've talked about that in the same way with home care workers, right? And what percentage of the wages are actually being brought to actual home care workers or in nursing home agencies, right? Versus the overhead costs that are being taken. And when enforcement has gone in and we've seen a raise in wages, we've seen a transformation in the care economy, the same for nursing. So Massachusetts and California are two states that have these fair staff to patient ratios. And we've seen an increase in productivity, better care, better mental health of the workers themselves and the communities being served in those states. And then we see states that have only a really weak enforcement policy, like a public reporting on the ratios. In states like New Jersey that still have, as I mentioned, workers on strike right now because they have 3 people to take care of an entire emergency room, right? So when can we pair the enforcement, invest resources in the enforcement, and uplift the rights of workers for the whole economy? I think that's when we see a lot of innovation.
Thanks, Ariana. Wendy?
Yeah, so many ideas are coming to mind. So I couldn't agree more, Ariana, in terms of actual enforcement of policies that are on the books and how important that is to workers actually realizing new rights and benefits. There was something, well, first of all, I should say, I think what's really promising is the number of states and cities that have established, for example, brand new whole cloth paid sick days policies, many of them paid sick and safe day policies, but also paid family medical leave policies. I mean, this is really exciting to see states and cities leading the way. And I definitely see that bubbling up to the national level in conversation. And, all of those movements have, a lot of organizing beneath them, a lot of workers' perspectives. These are about campaigns for unions. They are about campaigns for increased labor standards. They impact domestic workers to trucking, to construction workers, to restaurant workers. So the opportunity to realize that this really is about a holistic systemic change is right in front of us. So I think it's coming. I was smiling because as Sujai, you were talking about, in essence, this theme that we've had through the conversation about as we invest in infrastructure, we are realizing more and more that care is infrastructure. So I was thinking about, the innovation that we see. For example, a friend of mine was telling me about a bridge project that's being built that connects Oregon and Washington. So it's a great visual. And what she was sharing is that the common denominator for the employers and contractors who are really seeking that skilled and diverse workforce and therefore recruiting, for example, sometimes for the first time women onto these jobs, is that universally workers are saying and the employers are recognizing that they all have a common need. It's the need for childcare in non-standard hours. And when you start to dig into that, that there isn't a lot of non-standard hour care. So this is early hours, right? 4 a.m. sometimes in order to then get to the work site. And then when you really look under that, you realize that, whoever is providing that care is often, very underpaid. So the opportunity to bring all of those things together at the intersection of, workers who need care, care providers providing that care that is hard to find, and employers realizing that this is quintessential to their ability to recruit a skilled workforce and good for their bottom line is just a really interesting moment to be in. It's very promising.
Thanks, Wendy. Sujay, did you want to add
No,
anything?
there's also, I think, exactly to that point, there are often in multiple localities, it's a very different picture. It varies from region to region in terms of the richness of existing services and opportunities. Some regions, what they do is, again, state and local governments, they provide wraparound services, so they connect, what's available by local charities, local government, federal programs, etc., and then they knit those together into a system, which then is much more something that can actually be of benefit. I mean, it also lessens the search costs, because if you're a parent, you often don't know about a lot of what's available or how they can connect to provide a sort of a network or a safeguard in terms of how they will manage their family responsibilities and show up for work and at 4 o'clock in the morning if necessary. So a lot of this is, there's a lot of very positive stories around the country. There are also lots of places in the country where this is really not happening yet. So we can look internationally, but I think we should look nationally first. There are really, really strong examples of best cases, and we need to understand why and how those can be replicated across the country as well.
Thanks, Sujay. So we're getting some questions from our online audience. So I'm going to pull up some of those. So for folks watching online, if you would like to submit a question, please go ahead and do so. I'm going to start with a question that we got from Stephen, a workers' union representative. And the question is, it is hard to measure all aspects of the care economy, as a lot of it does not directly contribute to GDP. So what are some mechanisms that can be used to measure the contribution of care workers? Let me see if, Wendy, you do this often in your job. Do you want to start?
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of measuring the cost, I just want to go back and say we are paying a price. That price is borne by everybody across society, very much so families, workers in terms of, and here's another thing you can mention, their ability to stay employed in a job when, for example, a family emergency happens and they don't have the care that they need. We're paying those costs, not just families, but certainly individual businesses and the economy as a whole. And I think that's very quantifiable. On the flip side, you could say, companies that have stepped in early, for example, to lead on these issues and really ensure that workers have not just flexibility, but access to quality care supports when they need them, or care employers who pay their workers good wages with good benefits, and the retention that they have and satisfaction that they have among their employees. Those are all being quantified by those employers, and certainly the impact for a community at large is more prosperity, more equally shared. So I do think that those are all ways that we could be measuring, should be measuring. Often, again, we still ask the question, what does this cost us in terms of social policy? But really realizing we could flip that and value this work and these workers differently.
So there's one approach, which is to actually crunch the numbers. Another one is perhaps more intuitive. Think about there are countries in the world where the electricity goes on and off, the roads are in bad repair. These are countries that are often poorer countries, poorer societies, because the coordination that they require to overcome these sort of disruptions is significant. So we need to think about childcare not as a moral extracurricular priority, but something that is really core to our identity as a leading technology power, and this is something that is as essential as the water or the power or the bridges that we are that we don't seem to have a problem recognizing as essential. This is it's a soft infrastructure perhaps, but nonetheless as important, if not more.
Thanks, Sujai. So our next question is from Ashley at Georgetown University. She asks, so the Biden-Harris administration has repeatedly addressed labor issues through initiatives such as the Biden-Lula Partnership on Workers' Rights. I would note that today the administration is launching a global labor strategy out in San Francisco at APEC. What are some specific steps the administration can take to protect care economy workers? And I'm going to direct this, Ariana, to you. We have 1 year left in this term of the administration. What specifically would you like to see this administration do in their remaining time?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I think part of what we need to underscore again is the resources, the congressional resources to be able to actually implement the policies, because the policies and the possibility for the policies are there. We know that the coalition came together with a really, really robust plan that brought the care economy together, from nurses, nursing assistants, domestic workers, to look at that how more public investment would increase wages and working conditions, how enhancing paid sick leave and all the policies that Wendy spoke to would massively increase people's job security, right? But we need the investment in dollars in order for that coordination to be successful. And I think underlying it, whatever we say, whether it's an expansion of the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, whether it's, passing the safe staffing legislation, whether it's like increasing subsidies and childcare stabilization grants, all of that underscores the resources necessary to do that. So I think if there's a way for those resources to be implemented so that these agencies can coordinate this powerful work, I think that would make the most direct impact, particularly if we can increase the wages of workers. And underlying kind of a fair care economy is, if we imagine from the last question, what's the value? If care workers went on strike across the country, we would be shut down. From domestic workers who take care of people's children so they're able to go into the hospital, from the hospitals themselves, from the childcare facilities where people take their children, right? It would be impossible to run our economy without the powerful labor of care workers. So if we can invest across the board with the actual resources necessary, as well as particularly focus on wage increases through increasing living wage, as well as more public investment, I think that would be a significant transformation in the last year.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions we're getting about the situation internationally. One is, are there countries that you would point to that have successfully supported workers with those care responsibilities? And are there lessons we can learn from those situations here in the United States? We also have a comment from Bak Ryan Chang from Chang Medical Services, who's sharing some information with us about the care economy business in Japan and some of the support that the Japanese government has provided, but also some of the challenges in that industry. And so I'm interested to hear from you if you can point to examples internationally of where we've seen successful investment in the care economy, and do those models apply in the United States, or is our system, as maybe you were implying earlier, Sujai, just quite different and we need to think of our own solutions? So maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think I mentioned the fact that if you have a world-class infrastructure, that even the wealthy will use it, and you see you see the creche system in France, which I referred to earlier. The Japanese system is also an exemplar. But I think the solutions really have to be understood from the local level. I mean, there has to be some sort of a review of each locality. These are, we have to kind of, Americans are citizens, they have responsibilities as citizens. One of the issues that they need to work together, perhaps most urgently, is the issue of how do we balance contributing to the economy while also taking care of children and the elderly and others within their family or social networks. Those conversations have to now be renewed, and there are lots of examples, both internationally as well as domestically, as to what there has to be sort of a diagnosis of what is the problem locally, why are these services not being produced, what sort of linkages are not being connected, and why? Is it because, as I mentioned earlier, the local firms are afraid of others free riding on services that they may provide on a private basis? Is it because the local services are not connecting to each other, are not speaking to each other? There are a whole series of issues, and so what is the problem? How do you diagnose it, and how do you create a hybrid solution? Often the polar alternatives never work. It has to be something that connects both the public role as well as a private role to make something that works locally. And what we then have is a network of private solutions, private public solutions across the country that also have that are with the common link across them is certain normative principles that we have as a nation in terms of the quality of service, the accountability, and the protection for workers. Those kinds of mandates are also an important part of the mix. But the solutions have to be locally diagnosed, locally. This is sort of we've tended to, as Americans, not take our citizenship responsibilities as seriously as we ought to, but particularly when it comes to our families, we have to understand that we have to reach out to others in our community to solve these problems together. It's not easy. Citizenship is one of the reasons why American citizenship is so valued. And throughout history, one of the cultural advantages we've had as a nation is our ability to work and associate with each other as citizens to solve local problems locally, but within a broader framework that provides some amount of guidance as to what our values are. And so that has to be energized from the bottom up. The federal government can play a role by providing the impetus. I mean, for example, you see the legislation that was passed last year in terms of renewing manufacturing and infrastructure. That starts the conversation flowing. So there's a federal role as well. I mean, I'm not saying, just hand it all over to the citizens. That won't work either if you just do it purely on that level. So, but there has to be this, this conversation because it is, really core to our identity as a people, as a nation, and for our collective future. And it's, I think we need to sort of really play our economic future, our national security, as key to solving this problem, and not looking at it as some sort of a social benefit that is not core to what it is that we are as a nation.
Absolutely. That's certainly something to aspire to. We're coming up on time. I'm going to squeeze in one more question in case any of you have an answer to it, because I think it's quite interesting, which is many sectors of the U.S. economy are rapidly digitizing. They're relying increasingly on technology, and there's a lot of concern in other industries about replacing workers with technology, with AI, et cetera. The care economy is uniquely driven by humans and inherently requires people to participate in it. But are there technological solutions or innovations that do rely on technology that could ease some of the challenges that we're seeing in this sector? I don't know if any of you have a thought on that.
Well, part of the technology it can be used to actually help people navigate what care options are available in their communities. People often are not aware of what alternatives they have, or how they can connect them. Technology also helps us connect as citizens with our neighbors. So in terms of the costs of associating in order to solve a common problem, we have Facebook groups and so forth. Why can't we have, and there are, examples of our citizens connecting to each other to solve neighborhood issues. And this is, again, a community issue. And so this is something that technology can help solve. There are other, and we have, a very resourceful and entrepreneurial and innovative ethos in our country. I think, we need to put the challenge out there, use technology, what are the different ways in which we can help to solve grow the care economy. The care economy has to be a complex, networked, locally relevant, but nationally connected system. So where are the touch points, the connection points where technology can enhance the coordination, the resilience, and the intelligence within this care system?
Yeah.
So those are all opportunities for IT and other types of innovations to play into this.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. Ariana or Wendy, any final thoughts on that question or any other topic?
Yeah, I would just briefly add the double-edged sword of technology. I mean, I think there's a powerful opportunity, for example, for hard-to-reach workers like domestic workers having technological access to all of their rights and to be able to offer online training so that they can negotiate contracts fairly, right, and have access to that in multiple languages. Technology has opened the door for that, particularly during the pandemic, and numbers of organized domestic workers have grown because of technology access. I would say the other, double-edged sword here is that if, for example, we have the gig economy workers, and now care workers are being brought into the gig economy in many ways through apps. And if those apps could uphold higher standards of worker protections and wages, then that could actually be a really powerful way for direct care workers to be connected to families, as was just mentioned, as long as we baked into that the insurance of the enforcement of laws and protection of workers' rights. So I think there's an important new waves of connection that can be used as long as protections are respected. Yeah.
Thanks. Wendy, the final word to you.
Thanks so much for this conversation. I think one thing that has sort of threaded through our entire conversation, but maybe we haven't said it out loud so explicitly, is just the relationship between policy change and culture change, right? So we talked a lot in the conversation about how care work is feminized in our society and, really viewed as women's work, and, the misperception that women do this out of love and not for money, which of course it's out of love, but also needs to be valued. And, the fact that care is really the backbone of our economy. So, by taking these steps to really value care work, investing in childcare, and as we've all said, at that big level, that federal level, and making things like paid leave universal, we can shift the culture. You've seen it when states and cities start to make these changes. And it really just helps to show that everybody needs care, everybody relies on care, and everybody's going to benefit from these kinds of investments. So I think that's what I would leave this conversation with.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy, Ariana, Sujai, for a fantastic conversation, really connecting the personal, the fact that there's probably no one watching this conversation that isn't personally experiencing or knows someone who's personally experiencing some kind of care economy challenge, with the policy, right? The national security, economic policy, and human rights implications of this challenge. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness and your work in this space. And to our audience, thanks so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.